Hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast by Stephanie and Anastasia. Today, we're going to be answering the question, in what ways has globalization affected child labor in undeveloped countries? So, what is globalization? Globalization is a process of increasing interconnectedness and interdependence among people, businesses, and countries around the world. It is characterized by the free flow of goods, services, capital, technology, and information across national borders and the increasing integration of national economies into a global economy. Globalization has been driven by advances in technology, such as internet and telecommunications, which have made it easier and faster to communicate and do business across borders. It has also been fueled by policies and agreements that promote international trade and investment, such as free trade agreements and the liberalization of markets. Globalization has had a profound impact on economies, cultures, and societies around the world. It has led to increased economic growth and development in many countries, as well as greater access to goods and services for consumers. However, it has also contributed to rising income inequality, environmental degradation, and cultural homogenization, and has raised concerns about the power and influence of multinational corporations.
So, what is child labor? Child labor refers to any work performed by children under the age of 18 that is mentally, physically, socially, or morally harmful and interferes with their education and development. Child labor can take many forms, ranging from hazardous work in mines or factories to domestic work in households or agricultural work on farms. Child labor is considered a violation of children's rights and can have a negative effects on their health, education, and overall development. Children who work are often deprived of their opportunity to attend school, which can limit their future employment prospects and perpetuate the cycle of poverty.
Now we're going to talk about the effects. Globalization has had both positive and negative effects on child labor in undeveloped countries. On the one hand, globalization has increased demand for goods and services, which has led to increased employment opportunities for adults in many undeveloped countries. On the other hand, globalization has also created new opportunities for child labor, especially in industries such as agriculture, manufacturing, and mining. As global competition has intensified, many companies have sought to reduce costs by outsourcing production to countries with lower wages and weaker labor protections. This has led to a rise in child labor in some of these countries, as children are often more vulnerable to exploitation and abuse than adult workers. Moreover, globalization has also resulted in the displacement of many rural populations who have been forced to migrate to urban centers in search of work. This has resulted in many children being left behind in rural areas, where they are often forced to work in agriculture or other informal sectors. In summary, while globalization has helped to reduce child labor in some countries, it has also created new opportunities for exploitation and abuse. It is therefore essential to ensure that globalization is accompanied by effective policies and regulations to protect children's rights and prevent child labor.
So, some of the ways in which globalization has impacted child labor in undeveloped countries include outsourcing and supply chains. Globalization has led to the outsourcing of production to undeveloped countries with lower labor costs, which can result in the exploitation of child labor in supply chains. Children may be used for tasks such as picking crops or stitching clothes in factories, where they are often paid low wages and forced to work long hours. Urbanization. Globalization has led to growth of urban centers, which can displace rural population and increase the likelihood of child labor. Children who are left behind in rural areas may be forced to work in agriculture or other informal sectors, as their parents migrate to the city in search of work. International trade. Globalization has created new opportunities for international trade, which can lead to increased demand for goods and services produced by child labor. Children may be employed in industries such as mining or manufacturing, where they are subjected to dangerous working conditions and forced to work long hours. International standards and regulations. Globalization has also led to the creation of international standards and regulations aimed to protecting children's rights and preventing child labor. For example, the International Labour Organization has developed conventions to eliminate the worst forms of child labor, and many multinational corporations have adopted codes of conduct to ensure that their supply chains are free of child labor. Overall, the impact of globalization on child labor in undeveloped countries is complex and multi-faced. While globalization can create opportunities for economic growth and development, it can also exacerbate poverty and inequality, which can lead to increased child labor. It is essential to ensure that globalization is accompanied by effective policies and regulations to protect children's rights and prevent child labor.
What is an example from the past of how child labor was impacted by globalization? One example of how globalization has affected child labor in the past is the carpet industry in India in the 1990s. During this time, there was a surge in demand for hand-woven carpets in Western Europe, which led to an increase in production in India, where carpets were made using child labor. Children were often employed in small-scale family-owned carpet factories where they were required to work long hours and perform repetitive tasks such as knotting and weaving. Many of these children were from poor families, and their parents saw carpet weaving as a way for their children to earn income and contribute to the family's income. However, the use of child labor in the carpet industry came to international attention, and there was pressure from human rights organizations and consumer groups to address the problem. As a result, many carpet manufacturers agreed to adopt codes of conduct and implement monitoring and certification programs to ensure that their products were not made using child labor. This example illustrates how globalization can create new opportunities for child labor, but also how international pressure and cooperation can lead to positive changes to protect children's rights. It also highlights the importance of effective policies and regulations to prevent child labor and promote education and develop opportunities for children in undeveloped countries.
So, how has it played a part in national, regional, and global extent? Globalization has played a significant role in shaping the extent of child labor at national, regional, and global levels. While child labor has been a long-standing problem in many parts of the world, the forces of globalization have both contributed to and exacerbated the issue. At the national level, globalization has brought about changes in economic policies and labor laws that have had an impact on child labor. For example, in many developing countries, structural adjustment programs imposed by international financial institutions as a condition of loans have resulted in reduced public spending on social services, including education, and increased pressure on families to seek additional incomes through child labor. At the regional level, globalization has led to growth of global supply chains, which has facilitated the spread of child labor across borders. Many multinational companies outsource production to developing countries where labor costs are lower, often relying on suppliers who use child labor to keep costs down. In some cases, children are trafficked across borders for some purpose of labor exploitation. At the global level, globalization has led to increased competition and a race to the bottom in terms of labor standards. This has made it difficult for individual countries to regulate child labor effectively, as companies can easily relocate to countries with weaker laws and enforcement mechanisms. The lack of global consciousness on the definition of child labor, the minimum age of work, and other related issues has also hindered efforts to address the problem. Overall, globalization has created both challenges and opportunities in the fight against child labor. While it has facilitated the spread of child labor and made it difficult to regulate effectively, it has also created greater awareness and opportunities for international cooperation and action. The United Nations, for example, has developed a number of conventions and guidelines aimed to eliminate child labor, and many countries have taken steps to strengthen their legal frameworks and enforcement mechanisms in response.
Which historical events have been affected by the globalization of child labor? The first historical event is the growth of the Asian tigers, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan in the 1960s and 70s led to increased economic opportunities and reduced child labor in those countries. The second historical event was the United Nations adopted the Millennium Development Goals in the year 2000, which included a goal of achieving universal primary education, leading to increased access to education in many developing countries. The third historical event was the Rana Plaza factory collapsed in Bangladesh in 2013, which killed over 1,100 people, including many child laborers, brought attention to the unsafe and exploitative working conditions in the garment industry in developing countries. The fourth and final event was in 1996 the documentary The Price of Sugar, which exposed the use of child labor in the sugar industry in the Dominican Republic, where sugar was exported to major brands in the United States.
So how could globalization be applied to solve child labor issues? Managing and applying globalization process to address child labor issues requires a multi-phase approach that involves stakeholders and different levels, including governments, international organizations, civil society, and the private sectors. Here are some potential strategies.
The first way is to strengthen international cooperation. Globalization requires a coordinated international response to child labor. Governments, international organizations, and civil society must work together to develop and implement policies and programs that address the root causes of child labor, including poverty, lack of access to education, and weak labor standards. Strengthening international cooperation can also facilitate the sharing of best practices and lessons learned.
Second way is to promote responsible business practices. The private sector has a critical role to play in reducing child labor. Companies can be encouraged to adopt responsible business practices and prioritize respect for human rights, including the elimination of child labor from the supply chains. This can be achieved through engagement with stakeholders, the development of ethical codes of conduct, and the implementation of monitoring and reporting mechanisms.
The third way is to improve access to education. Education is a key factor in reducing child labor. We need to work together to increase access to quality education, particularly in developing countries where child labor is most prevalent. This can include initiatives such as building schools, providing scholarships, and developing vocational training programs.
Fourth way is to strengthen legal frameworks. Strong legal frameworks are critical to addressing child labor. Governments can strengthen their laws and regulation to prohibit child labor and ensure that children are protected from exploitation. This can include setting minimum age requirements for work, increasing penalties for violation, and establishing monitoring and enforcement mechanisms.
The fifth and final thing that can be done is support the development of sustainable livelihoods. Child labor is often driven by economic necessity. Governments and international organizations can work together to support the development of sustainable livelihoods for families, particularly in developing countries. This can include initiatives such as microfinance programs, vocational training, and job creation.
Overall, managing and applying globalization processes to solve child labor issues requires a comprehensive approach that addresses the root causes of the problem. By working together and taking a coordinated approach, stakeholders can create opportunities for children while reducing the risk of child labor.
This graph by the International Labour Organization and UNICEF shows the difference between 2000 and 2020 and how child labor has increased and decreased. As you can see, in 2000 it's at around 245 million, and then in 2012 it goes down to 168 million. In 2016 it continues to decrease, and in 2020 it ends at around 160 million. This shows just how drastically and how fast everything can change. This graph is for children between the ages of 5 and 17, which is around the same ages of children at our school. These children don't have access to a good education, and that's really unfortunate, so we have to do everything that we can to help. Overall, as we have said before, globalization has affected child labor in undeveloped countries in many ways, positive and negative. We can only hope that for the future it continues to influence in a positive manner. Thank you for listening to our podcast, and we'll see you next time.